Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is Global Payroll, Compliance, Culture and Communications. My name is Jerome Smale, I'm editor of Payroll World, and I'm joined by three speakers today. We have Christine Kiley, who's Global Tax and Payroll Director for Immedis. We also have Mark Graham for Immedis, who's Executive Director. And we have David Leboff, who's Co-Chair of the American Payroll Association Global Issues Subcommittee. You'll see their pictures there. Unfortunately, Mark's a late addition, so we don't have a picture of Mark. It's not because he's shy or scary looking. It's just he's a late addition. So today we'll be going through an agenda of 6 topics. So we have the complexities of global payroll, developing a global payroll strategy, key compliance trends, cultural differences impacting payroll, communications and technology, practical top tips for running a smooth global payroll function is the 6th and final topic on the agenda. Now, I'm going to ask the speakers to tell us a little bit more about themselves and what they do. Christine, could we start with you? Can you tell us about your role?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christine Kiley, and I work with Immedis. The core business of Immedis is to provide international payroll and employment tax services to employers with staff in multiple jurisdictions, whether local or expatriate. We have a strong international payroll team working alongside our team of tax professionals, helping to ensure compliance for our clients. This is all underpinned by our global payroll platform, which helps to consolidate data and simplify reporting.
Okay, thanks Christine. Mark, can you tell us about what you do and also describe the way you look, because we don't have a picture of you.
I've got a face for radio, as they say. I'm nicely placed here, but very good to be with you. I don't want to say this afternoon, I appreciate we have a global audience, so very good to be with you all today. I'm Mark Graham, as Jerome mentioned. I'm Executive Director in Immedis, and as Christine outlined about our business, we provide an international payroll service, and that's provided through a team of global payroll experts. But the service is also supported by an intuitive payroll platform, and my role in the business is to develop and to improve this platform. And really that's the reason for my late addition today, because we're having some conversations internally around the communications piece in international payroll and how that's helped by technology. So we just thought I'd jump on and have a little conversation on the technology piece a little bit later in the WebEx and kind of show you why the technology is paramount in the delivery of the payroll.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us. And David's calling in from the States today. David, can you tell us a bit about what you do over there?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Leboff. As you saw on the lead slide, I'm a co-chair of the American Payroll Association Global Payroll Issues Subcommittee. Have served there for about 5 years. Additionally, I'm the president of Expaticore in New York. We've been serving clients since 2002 with global payroll, expatriate payroll, and global mobility solutions to clients of all sizes and across all industries.
Okay, thanks very much, David. This is an interactive webinar, so throughout the webinar we'll be asking a number of poll questions. We actually have 4 polls for you today. Also, you can send in your questions for us if you use the questions tab, and do keep those questions coming in. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time to answer some of those. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll still get to your questions. We'll still send you the answers to those as well. So we're going to kick off with our first poll question, which will be coming up on your screen now. And the question is, how do you manage your global payroll requirements? And your options for this are locally in-house, local outsourced providers, consolidated providers, aggregator, business process outsourcer, or a combination of the above. So if you'd like to cast your votes now. Okay, so we can see those results coming in, and there's a fairly even split there between, it's changing all the time, so combination is the most popular there. So That's interesting. Okay, so let's crack on with our webinar topics, and the first of those is the complexities of global payroll. So, Christine, we've got a note here about the complexity saying one size does not fit all. That's quite a good summary, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that the one size doesn't fit all summarises the overall feeling, and if we just move on to the next slide, where we actually decided it'd be a good idea just to talk about different countries and different rules here as a background to this. So, as many of you will already know from working in global payroll, employment law rules do differ from location to location, and of course income tax rules and rates vary considerably from location to location. Country differences are relevant not only from the employee's perspective, but this is also an employer worry, and the employer does need to be mindful of the various differences which can arise. This is also coupled with practical challenges such as time zones, language and cultural practices, bringing us back to one size does not fit all. Some examples of country differences which could arise would be, for example, the different working week, our Saturday and Sunday rest days in location, or our, for example, Friday and Saturday rest days. The method of delivery of payment to employees can also differ substantially from location to location. Is it by bank transfer, is it by cheque, or is it by cash? What is the norm in the location? The method of delivery of the payslip, is it by soft copy or is it by hard copy? And employee expectations, whether this is on a gross versus a net basis. So in some locations, when you're having discussions with employees, they may be of a belief that you're talking about a net pay basis, whereas the employer could have a different opinion, and a misunderstanding here could be very costly. The standard working hours per week, it's important to be mindful of country limitations which may apply here. Also, the number of pay periods per year. Are there 12? Are there 13? Or, like Belgium, is it 13.92? Holiday pay. Is holiday pay included in the gross salary figure per the contract, or is this an additional amount that the employees due? And payment frequency. The norm can vary from location to location. It could be monthly in some locations, whereas other locations the expectation from employees is that it be bi-weekly. A particular challenge faced by the employer operating in multiple jurisdictions and relevant to the various items I just talked about is the fact that for employers operating on an international basis, on occasion they will be dealing with an employee who is more familiar with the local rules than the employer.
Okay, so carrying on with the complexities on the next slide, we've got two groups here. We've got locals and expats divided. So how do these differ, Christine?
Yeah, so we thought it was worthwhile taking two different categories of employee here, as you said there, Jerome, the local as compared to the expat. These two types of employee need to be managed very differently from a payroll perspective. If you have expatriates on your payroll, you'll probably have sympathy for one of my clients who has 20 expats out of 2,000 on their payroll, and recently told me that those 20 expats took up over 70% of the time of the payroll team. When dealing with local employees in different countries, employers will generally end up looking at matters such as collective agreements, local employment law issues, and employer withholding obligations. This means, of course, that payroll can't sit in isolation and will need tax and legal support in order to ensure compliance in all locations. Employers then dealing with expats will be familiar with issues including home and host country personal tax compliance and filing deadlines, shadow payrolls, withholding tax requirements in host locations, home country withholding and applications to reduce or remove this obligation, policies such as tax equalisation or tax protection, hypothetical tax deductions, double taxation relief, social security regulations, bilateral agreements and documentation. The key to survival with an expat population is strong policy documents and clear communication from the outset. When it comes to employee issues in general, whether that is an expat or a local hire, an executive or a casual worker, clear policy and communication can save a lot of heartache.
Thanks, Christine. So moving on to our next topic, which is developing a global payroll strategy. I think we're going to talk about 3 steps towards doing that, David. But first of all, the question there says it all, where to start?
Yes, and so we're having this conversation today about global payroll, and as Christine very ably pointed out, there's a tremendous amount of complexity in running an efficient global payroll program. So, is it safe to kind of run away from it and say, I just want to go back to my domestic payroll role? And I think the answer is no. And it comes from looking at statistics that show over the last 10 years, there's been a 500% increase in the U.S. in international trade. And international trade is essentially a combination of the export and import of all goods and services here. So that's up from $1 trillion to $5 trillion. The point there being, if you are not dealing with global payroll today, if your company is not working internationally in some way, shape, or form, it will be soon. So let's first start with a definition of what global payroll is. In essence, it's the sum of all activities that are required to coordinate and manage the operation of payrolls in more than one country for a single employer. Global payroll administration includes the acquisition of information, right, data required to calculate payroll. That is sort of joiners, leavers, changes to earnings, and demographic changes. The completion of both employee and employer compliance, so the employer payroll forms as well as, let's say, annual and period pay slips. Remittance of funds to statutory authorities. The delivery of net pay to employees, accounting and management information reporting, data retention, and compliant operation now within a global regulatory frame, and we'll talk about that later. So the point being that, yeah, it's complicated. We're now going to kind of break it down into pieces to think about as we develop a strategy for our firm to get better at, to enter into global payroll or to get better at it. Jerome, please move the slide.
Right, yeah, so we have those 3 steps that I mentioned.
Yeah, so here we go. The first thing you do to develop your global payroll strategy is to evaluate where you are today. Where you are today, includes certain attributes. You might be new to global, right? Your organization may have its first acquisition. You may have 2 or 3 countries that are operating independently at this point from a payroll perspective, and your organization is seeking to make it more transparent to understand what's going on in each location. And it's often difficult with a new company to gather that data effectively. You may be a growing and maturing payroll operation. That is, you're a company that maybe has had global payroll operations for some years. You've got some sort of a governance group, and we'll talk about governance in a little while. You've got a global payroll management evolving, meaning, who's running it. You're getting some reporting capability, both internally and visibility to what's going on. And you're probably beginning to think about aggregating some of the payroll processes if you're not being effective in doing those payrolls yourself, meaning you're looking to outsource support. And finally, there's the mature organization with regard to payroll. And that is a company that may have been operating for many, many years in the international market. Think of your General Motors and General Electrics of the world. And you have means and methods by which you are governance. You have your governance operating. You have service standards. You have a way that you do it, whether you do it internally, externally, shared service, functional, and we'll talk about those in a little while. And you're gaining business intelligence out of your operation. So those are sort of the 3 evolutionary attributes of global payroll operations. Now let's talk about some internal attributes, right? Attributes of your organization itself, the size, whether you centralize or centralized, typically you're decentralized, whether you're a functional, regional, or shared services organization. How many locations do you have to manage? How large is each one versus the other? How many employees do you have around the world? Do you have technology at this point that is supporting the global payroll operation, facilitating it? Do the resources that are running your program have skills and competencies that they need? As you heard from Christine before, this is very complicated. And if you blow something in payroll, people don't get paid right, they don't get paid timely, or compliance doesn't happen correctly, and that's costly. And finally, does your organization have an inclination to outsource or to keep things internal? And so thinking about structure, strategy, I should say, think about how your organization fits into that. You then, under step 2, try to define what your future organization is going to look like. Okay, right now maybe we don't have governance, and as I said, we'll talk about that, or a great idea about how to allocate roles and responsibilities and authority internally within our function. Figure out what it is that you want to get to, and you can do this by talking to peers, talking to vendors and experts in the industry to get that future state concept. And then you create a plan to get you from where you are. That's intuitive, but that essentially those are the 3 steps. If we move on to the next slide, Jerome, please.
Okay. This is like a picture of what's going on in a global payroll manager's head at any given time, right?
That's it.
Actual brain scan.
So here it is, and that's a great way to think about it. We're trying to get all of these things to be organized nicely. If any components of them are not at the moment, your strategy will help you get there. Again, what we're talking about here in sum, even though there's all this mess out there, we want to figure out how to acquire information for payroll from an HR system or multiple ones, push them into the local payrolls who are going to process them, calculate gross to net calculations, ensure that taxes are paid to authorities, that employees are getting paid, that compliance is being done, that pay slips are being presented, management is getting reports. That's it in sum. Okay, so what you have to start to picture when you look at this is organizing these into those components. And we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, program management.
Yes, so the key to a healthy global payroll organization is to balance these organizational components. Starting from the top, a good rational function, a good rational organization model. Okay, and what that really means is saying there needs to be authority. People who are supposed to be making decisions are in the right places. People who are supposed to be executing are in the right places. And this is important because payroll folks are very, very responsible people, and they will take on decision-making at times that they shouldn't be or don't have to, when that really rests with, for example, maybe a tax council internally, right? If you want to know how something should be taxed in Kenya, you shouldn't try to intuitively figure out what that should be. If there's a question, you may want to pose that. You should be posing that to tax council. They're sitting on governance. Is an employee a contractor or are they an employee? And that ought to go to your legal counsel, and that shouldn't ordinarily be a decision being made if you're not certain about it at the payroll operational level or the program management level. So the point is your organization has to be set up right. Your resources, as we said before, need to have competencies and in global payroll, and they need to be in the roles where they execute well, right? So somebody who needs to know about tax treaties needs to be in your organization, or if not, you either have to train up or you have to outsource the expertise. So take a look at your organization, figure out where there are gaps. There needs to be controlled process and workflow to ensure secure, compliant transfer of data and activity. You need fit-for-purpose technology to facilitate the flow of all that data and to assist with workflow. You need practical administrative policies. I've seen in countless expatriate policies where some very well-meaning HR or mobility head has put a policy in place to be flexible for their staff, to allow them to change their split of pay between two or multiple currencies every pay period. That wreaks havoc among payroll professionals who have to figure out how to report that correctly. So the policies have to be correctly set. And finally, you need to be able to measure your performance. How are you doing? In the U.S., the American Payroll Association publishes data annually on errors. And in the domestic payroll world, error rates are, in the hundredths of a percent. That, someone gets FICA wrong by a penny, that counts as an error. In the international world, errors can include expatriates who might get double paid because maybe they're being paid at home and at host for the same rent, if you will. And if there's a gross up on that, a $20,000 payment can very quickly become a $35,000 error, a single error. So the point is, you want to measure errors both in numbers and in materiality. But the point is, these are the organizational components that you need to be thinking about for a healthy global payroll program, right? And the skills and competencies we mentioned before, just so you're thinking about them, include program management, vendor management, global tech, foreign exchange, country registration, setting up in new countries, that is, tax treaties, employment law basics, expat policies, and some global regulatory items like data privacy and anti-bribery legislation. We'll talk about those shortly. Please move on to the next slide.
Okay. So we have global payroll operating model alternatives here, David.
Great. So we're now, if you think about that strategy, right, your company is split, as we've said, into sort of three levels. And governance, as I had mentioned before, is that group that has certain authorities over the whole global payroll program. They may not be managing the process every day, but they are overseeing it and have a very, very important role. They're going to work with the payroll program management to decide, and the company itself, to decide what program management model to use. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes. What accounting protocols are going to be put into place. They'll approve program budgets. They are going to approve the relevant policies. So if you think about what we were talking about before about split pay policy, if that policy is in place, a program manager would go to the governance board to say, hey, we need to change that policy. And the governance has the right to direct human resources to change that policy. Tax and legal opinions come out of the governance group. They will execute certain contracts with outsourced vendors like business process outsourcers, aggregators, and we'll talk about what those are in a few minutes, and local processors if they're outside of your organization. And finally, they'll also approve budgets and the decision on technology to use if your company decides to take in some specialized tech. They'll approve performance standards, right? We spoke before that you've got to measure how this is all doing. And finally, treasury strategies, how we're going to move money around the world. You might have 3 people who are researchers in a location and they're not generating local currency. How do you get the currency in to pay them? Things like this. So that's your governance group. Your program management group in the middle has a seat, as I said, on the governance team. They are the ones who are going to monitor and measure the performance of the overall program. They need to ensure that the program is operating within that privacy framework and other global regulatory frame. They are going to work with the vendors, the outsourced vendors, if and as you have them. They're going to be responsible for global management reporting, integrating global and local tech, right? So each local processor has a technology that has to move into that consolidating technology. They'll be responsible for compliance oversight and key hires in the program level and maybe even in some of the more important locations. They need to ensure that the right skills and competencies are in place across the global payroll program in every country. They need to understand expat and ensure that the policies are being adhered to, and to be sure that locally expat programs are being reported compliantly. They also will have a seat on the new country implementation team. So when your company is going into a new location, that program manager or program management function needs to be part of that. And finally, for those of you who think, okay, it's mundane to just be the processor in this global program, back in 1990, I worked for PepsiCo, and we were going into new locations. And at that particular point, we were going into Russia right after the wall came down. We had a staff of 24 people who sat around a table with one telephone in a room, and payroll processing was not what it is today. We had to go to what was roughly called a bank, which was an open kiosk in the lobby of a very well-trafficked hotel, actually the nicest hotel in Russia at the time, called the Slovenskaya. We walked up to that kiosk, and they shot out 200 ruble notes. There was no such thing as a checking or a banking account. Everything was cash. The 200 ruble notes were sort of £4 or £5 each to pay those 24 people in the middle of this highly trafficked lobby. We stuffed all that currency into gym bags. We sort of ran through the lobby into a waiting taxi cab and took that cash back to the 24 people in the big table, and we split it all up, happy that we didn't meet the same fate that the owner of the hotel did in that same lobby, unfortunately, when he was killed by the mafia there. But the point is that the in-country processing isn't just a set of laws and regulations that you have to adhere to. It also includes common practice and understanding of literally just how to get the process done locally. If we can move on, Jerome.
Yeah. So more on payroll governance.
Yeah. And this slide, just sort of to visually give you an idea of those folks who have responsibilities for effective global payroll program operation. Again, as I said, they are not specifically charged, other than the payroll program manager, with operating the program, but they have very, very important roles to play in with authority, decision-making, budgets, etc., opinions, and the like. Okay, we can move on.
Okay. So process control and performance.
So sort of in sum here, it's important to, when you're thinking about a global payroll strategy, to think through that it's, what you're trying to do at the end of the day, of course, is to deliver payroll on time. But there is a lot more that is going on to ensure that your payroll is accurate, it's complete, that management is paying in the currencies that they're supposed to, and that the tools that you're using are facilitating and effective, with supporting not only the management of the data back and forth, but the workflow of the payroll program. So if we can move on to this next slide, please.
Okay. So this is a calendar we have here.
Yeah. So and what this is just a picture of where payroll technology has been evolving over my many years. As I said, I've been in this global workforce management business a long time. I like to say that I've been here since expatriates have been coming to the U.S. on wooden ships. But the technology to support this has evolved beautifully from just being data management to now workflow management. And calendars, for example, are a very good example of that. And here's just a picture of one. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jerome.
Yeah. So, Mark, would you like to tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah. So, Jerome, I think just to Dave's point, where the payrolls have evolved, what we're looking at here is a calendar that we would set up with our clients at implementation. This is a calendar that shows milestones throughout a pay period, and what those milestones are milestones that sit with the client in a payroll process, but also with the provider, to ensure that you have a timely payroll and that everything is delivered on time, on schedule, and compliantly. You must have a rigid calendar that's adhered to. And what this is showing is just actually an example from our portal of what the calendar page looks like. This calendar is a pre-agreed calendar. All the milestones in here must be agreed, and the timelines included in the milestones must work for all parties. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of how the payroll or how the calendar works. I certainly think it's come a long way. The payroll process that Dave ran through there sounded more like a scene out of Ocean's 11 than a payroll we're used to working with now. So it's nice to have it. We've moved on a little bit since wooden ships and guns and gym bags in the Russian hotels.
Yeah, that's far from mundane, as David said there. So, thanks for that, Mark. We're going to get interactive again. We've got not one but two poll questions coming up for you. So we've got our second poll question of the webinar here. And the question is, what payments methods do you use for international staff wage payments? And your options here are local entity bank accounts, international bank transfers, third-party FX provider, a combination of the above, or don't know, or perhaps it's not applicable. So please make your choices now and vote now. We'll wait for those results to come in. This is always, there we are, they start to come in now. So we don't have any don't know, so everybody has a good idea, so that's good, always good. So local entity bank account is the most popular option there. So that's interesting. Right, we'll move on to our next poll question now, which is, how do you manage expats via withholding requirements? So your options here are shadow payroll where required, via year-end tax returns, perhaps you don't do anything, or other, or again, don't know or not applicable. So you've got the results coming in now. So option A there is obviously hugely popular. Okay, so and just a reminder, while we're being interactive, do keep your questions coming in, and we'll have time to answer those at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions regarding anything that's being said or not being said, perhaps a question that you need answering, do let us know, and we'll get to that at the end of the webinar. So now we're going to move on to our next topic, which is compliance, which covers local laws and global regulatory frameworks. Well, David gave us a very good example of how things are done differently in different countries. Perhaps that's an extreme example, and as Mark said, things have moved on since then, but still the differences in local legislation are obviously a very significant factor in global payroll, and it's obviously one of the, if not the key issue, Christine.
Yeah, when we talk about compliance, we definitely want to avoid situations where people get shot in lobbies. Generally, when we talk about the big stick that we're trying to avoid in compliance, it's more in the area of fines and penalties than knives and guns. Apologies in advance if the topic is a little mundane after that exciting piece earlier. When putting in place a global payroll solution, employers find themselves at risk of falling out of compliance with local tax and employment legislation. And this is a forever changing landscape, which means that no one individual can really be an expert in all locations. So without specialised support, it can be difficult to stay abreast of real changes. Businesses do need to take seriously the risks involved, and they need to ensure that they seek assistance from a tax, payroll and legal perspective before expanding into new locations. When seeking advice, it's also important to make sure that the advisors are familiar and experienced with your type of business. So that means that if you're an employer operating in multiple jurisdictions, a local expert in each location may not be as familiar with your type of structure as a global operation might be. So if we move on to the next slide then, we'll see that we have summarised here some of the key trends that we are seeing on a global basis when it comes to payroll and employment taxes matters. It has been said that the world is becoming a more global place. Governments share information more than before, and global standards are being applied. So this results in sometimes similar approaches or trends, as we've labelled them here. And it's becoming therefore more and more important to have a consolidated approach to global operations. So on this slide, as I said, we see a number of the key trends that we have noticed impacting employers over the last number of years. The first one here being exchange of information across borders. Now, over the last number of years, sharing of information between both domestic government bodies and global tax authorities has increased significantly. And this has been the result of various exchange of information initiatives, such as FATCA in the US and the European Savings Income Directive. The motivation for the exchange of information is international cooperation in tax matters, and also to assist countries in the enforcement of domestic law. And communication between tax authorities in different jurisdictions has become more commonplace, with the sharing of information greatly assisting tax authorities with the enforcement of compliance in cross-border matters. So this means that more than ever before, it's important to have a consolidated approach to your global operations, where all information can be centrally stored and managed, and where communications across borders can be managed by individuals who also have a vision of the global arrangements rather than just their piece. The next trend we've listed here on the slide is the shift of responsibility. And in many jurisdictions, we have seen a shift of responsibility to self-assessment type models in relation to the filing and paying of taxes. And here we see the overall compliance and calculation responsibility is passed to the taxpayer, or in this instance the employer. And this goes hand in hand with technology advances such as online filings and real-time reporting. For example, in the UK, we've seen the introduction of the RTI. So employers need to put in place protections for themselves to ensure that they are not exposed to risk. In order to keep up to date with rule changes and in order to ensure that filings are correct in multiple jurisdictions, it's important to make sure that your payroll technology can notify you of your filing deadline obligations. Data protection then. People involved in payroll will be aware that they have access to the most sensitive data, and everyone is becoming more and more concerned with regard to data protection responsibilities. This concern is also getting more and more serious with the GDPR only around the corner in May 2018. And the impact of GDPR can't be made light of, and it has been cited as one of the most wide-ranging pieces of legislation passed by the EU in recent years. So although this is an EU regulation, it does also have an impact on businesses outside of the EU too, and it also brings with it threats of significant fines up to 4% of turnover or 20 million. So organisations will need to make sure that they understand the impact of this new legislation on their business. They need to determine an approach, and they also need to look at potential recruitment needs here. And the GDPR is likely to have significant budgetary and governance implications for many businesses. The next point on the slide here is the human touch. And we see opposing challenges here, whereas in some countries we are seeing a trend whereby there is less scope to interact with humans in tax offices. And this is, of course, more efficient for tax authorities, but it can be very challenging when trying to do business in a location. In other locations, we actually see the opposite. So, for example, in some African locations, there's still a need to attend tax offices in person for registrations, filings, and receipts. Moving on then, the next trend we thought worth discussing is internal reporting requirements. We are seeing a definite trend towards global consolidation of reports, with employers needing reports that can be easily manipulated on a country-by-country basis and on a global basis, meaning that separate gross to net reports per country is becoming a thing of the past. One size may not fit all, and each country may differ significantly, but in general, the requirement for the final report to be in a consistent format is increasing. Treaty interpretation then. So it's difficult enough to keep up to date with legislation changes, but it's even more difficult to keep up to date with more subtle changes, such as a government's interpretation of an issue. So, for example, in Ireland, we recently saw a suggestion there from the government to move to an economic employer interpretation. Now, the impact of this can mean, for example, the difference between no tax obligations in a jurisdiction versus the requirement to set up and run a payroll. Global anti-avoidance strategies. So examples of such measures would be transfer pricing, CFC rules, and BEPS. And the focus really here being the protection of the tax take for each country. And this would usually take the form of preventing, in one way or another, the transfer of the taxation of an income source to a lower tax jurisdiction. And a recent example of that now would be the recent Apple case in Ireland.
Right, and the next, number 8, is anti-corruption. David, I believe you have an insight into this.
Yeah, so very quickly, these last three are at our global regulatory trends, if you will. As Christine just pointed out, there are a lot of compliance trends that a program manager needs to be comfortable with, both the important local ones as well as the global ones. And these last three are really about anti-corruption. This is like the UK anti-bribery legislation, US FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, anti-money laundering, making sure that money is being transferred legally, and OFAC in the U.S., which is about anti-terrorist, monitoring to make sure that funds are not ending up in the hands of bad people. Just two very quick stories here, and I apologize, no guns, but one.
You like guns? Stories.
We had a client recently who was operating a resources mining operation in a country in Africa, and they were using a third party to employ their local people. That third party had struck a special deal with the government to avoid having to pay Social Security, which was against local legislation. That gave, besides being against the law, that created a anti-competitive situation. In essence, they got a business advantage for that. And as part of a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigation, the company decided to move away from that for the obvious reason and hand that the local payroll compliance business directly to our firm, where we operated compliantly. Another form of this, and again, you don't ordinarily think of payroll as participating in activities that are illegal or in any way, but Tyson's Foods, which is a large U.S. poultry organization, company, I think the second largest or the largest here, had an operation in Mexico. And the health inspectors from Mexico were essentially, quote unquote, paid off by hiring the spouses of those inspectors and putting them on the payroll. So Tyson's, once that was figured out, received a $4 million fine, and hopefully, our chickens are now up to snuff. But anyway, with that, let's move on.
Yeah, so the next topic is the impact of culture on payroll. So we've spoken about how things are done differently in different countries as far as regulation is concerned, but there are other obstacles such as language, working practices and processes, it says here, Christine.
Yeah, so I guess we've seen from the conversation today that payroll is certainly not a boring job, a boring place to be working in, and I know that the last section was probably a little bit heavy going at times, so we just thought that we'd move on from just a little bit lighter here now, and we have a look at how cultural differences can impact on the processing of an on-time and accurate payroll. So companies with global operations will face many challenges in dealing with individuals in different locations around the world in bringing together the end product. Not everyone speaks the same language, but not only that, as teams try to work across borders, they will encounter challenges arising from specific cultural differences, for example, timeliness, responsiveness and ownership mentality. And generally, over time, people working together across borders will learn to overcome these challenges, and they'll often meet somewhere in the middle. In general, communication is key, and discussions regarding cultural differences should be encouraged in order to facilitate smooth operations in the business. Communications will also be greatly improved through the establishment of policies and the use of technology and tracking tools which can be accessed securely from all locations.
Okay, so moving on, we come to our final poll question. So your question here is, which of the following global payroll/finance reports are, or would be if you could have them, most important for you? So your options are gross to net reports, consolidated and per country, payslip reports for all employees, exceptions, changes reports for every country, general ledger reports, or payments report, file uploads. So if you'd like to make your choices now, I can see some of you have already chosen, so those results coming in now. So again, A is by far the most popular option there. So now on to communications, and we're going to be talking about using technology to overcome the communications challenges. Mark, if I could ask you to talk a bit about this, please.
Absolutely, Jerome. Thanks a million. So I suppose what I want to do here is just talk about communications as Jerome outlined from the perspective of the technology and how the technology can work and how it can help. So can you move on to the next slide actually, Jerome, please?
Sure.
And so what we're looking at here is to say to ensure a streamlined delivery, all communications in payroll, be it a domestic payroll or international, it's very important that all the communication is concise and that that everything is actioned in a timely manner. So if you're using an outsourced provider, it's very important that you look at a number of different areas and make sure that they can provide those points to you. So the first and most important point, I think, is that the provider will appoint a single point of contact who has complete global overview. So that improves the communications immediately. You're dealing and communicating with one person, and that person has complete overview of your payroll, all the changes that are being made, all the compliance changes that may be, all the rule changes country by country. They have global overview, and they can, relay this information to you. And then you also get support in knowing that one person has ownership of the process. So to move along then to, why is the technology important? And I think you can maybe push on again, Jerome, to the next slide. And what the next slide shows here is just the homepage of the Immedis International Payroll Platform. So why is this technology important, and what do you need from it? Well, it's important because you need a system that's going to help you deliver payroll on time. You're looking at multiple countries where you have different public holidays, you have different time zones. In some situations, you have a different working week. So you need a self-service option where you can go in and manage your payroll. You need to have global overview of the payroll, and the best way to do that is to have a technology that can showcase you exactly in the process where your payroll is. So what we've actually done to improve the communication and obviously to improve overview is that we've color-coded the processes of the payroll here. So there's five different levels in the process, and each are shown with a colour as well. But that's the important side from the communication, that you can see where you are in the process and how everything moves along. So you have your single point of contact, you have your online access where you can look at the information. So the next piece in it really is that this system needs to be able to talk to and share information with your existing systems. So if you have internal HR systems, and obviously from a finance perspective as well, you need to be able to feed the information back to the system. So it's important that you have concise and consolidated information going back from your payroll system, and that improves the communication back to your finance team. So the system here needs to be able to house all your employee information, so that's getting the information from your systems, but to house the information and the changes. It needs to be easy to use. That keeps the whole system a little bit easier as well when you're able to use a tool that is intuitive and that works with your needs. And it needs to have multiple levels of authorization. So if we can actually move on to the next slide, Jerome. What the next slide shows is the Manage tab. The Manage tab in a payroll portal is where you'll spend most of the pay period as a payroll administrator, as a payroll manager. So what this allows you to do is to input the changes on a monthly basis or a weekly or bi-weekly, whatever it might be. So input those changes through a change request, and it allows you to then, that information is then sent directly to your provider. Then your provider, in this case Immedis, processes the payroll through their multiple in-country offices, and then the information is fed back into the system where you can review it. So this is keeping the communications open. This is keeping the communications very, very clear. Now what you can do is you log in, and you review, and you approve. So you're approving the payroll. That's what I was talking about earlier on when I referenced the level of authorization. You need to have different levels of authorization so that a person in a specific jurisdiction may be able to make changes to the payroll, but they won't be able to approve it. So it's very important that with your provider, or if you're looking to the market for a provider, that they can provide that to you, that you have different levels of authorization, so that different people can make different changes, but may not necessarily be able to approve the payrolls as well. So moving along, what else should be in here? Reporting is ultimately important. Christine and I sat with a company in the US very recently, and I thought it was put very well. They told us that their global reporting looks like a ransom note. It pulls together so many different pieces of information from different systems. So you're looking at PDFs, Excels, CSVs, and in some cases notes on the back of pieces of paper, trying to bring that all together for one consolidated report. So it's very important in the ongoing payrolls that you have consolidated reporting, So a system should be able to supply you with consolidated reporting. And I suppose that, back to the point on the communications, you should be able to have a self-service option. You need to be able to log in and pull reports on demand when you want them. So when you're going to market, make sure that that's what people are able to provide to you. Also important in this whole process, obviously, is the secure storage of your data. As Christine alluded to earlier on, this is something that's only becoming more and more important as time moves on, because we're housing very sensitive information, and it's very important that you ensure that when you're talking to somebody that you have that covered off, and also a clear audit log on the full process where all the changes have been made, and a time and a date stamp and a user stamp on that, so you know where all the pieces are. And maybe the last piece just on communication, and it's communication back to the employee. So also very important that the employee has self-service option to get to their own payslips. So looking at a portal or looking at a service, you must have an employee login, so where an employee can log in and can access all their previous payslips. So that's the employee that's in a foreign jurisdiction working on a Sunday when the payroll team in the home location is not working. They need access to their payslips. They need to be able to access that immediately. So that's a service that you should be offering your clients, your employees as well. But it's all about keeping everything concise, keeping it clear, keeping it simple. There's a lot of work that's done in the processing of a payroll, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, saying that everybody here is very aware of the work involved. But from the communication side, keep it simple, make sure that there's a clear audit log, and make sure that you have, if you're outsourcing, make sure that you're given a single point of contact, somebody you can communicate with directly, and then that you have the piece of technology that allows you to access reporting at the click of a button. So that's it, Jerome, from my side on the communications.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. So finally, we have some practical top tips. David, the clock is ticking on us, so we're running out of time.
Sure.
A bit. But so if you could just talk us through these briefly, please.
Yeah, next slide. So very, very quickly, the top tips are, number one, structure your program based on your where you are in your evolution, your culture, your corporate culture, and your structural attributes. Source strong global payroll technology, kind of like the one you've just seen, to help facilitate your program. Make sure you have the global payroll competencies that required to operate, or else either get them through training or outsource them. Expats are critical. Build that competency within your function. It's always good to go to your peers. That's how we learn the most at American Payroll Association. We always say lean on your peers. Develop and stick to process discipline, which includes allocating decision-making authority and responsibility to the right roles within your organization. And finally, be aware and be sensitive to the local cultures and communication preferences of your international team. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, David. So we're coming to the end of the webinar now, but we've got time to go through some of your questions. So I'll put these to our speakers. Okay, so somebody says here, I've been a global management accountant and have also been processing payroll for the last 29 years. Will I need a license to start payroll in LA, California, US-wide? What is the best way to get clients there? Would you recommend the software? That's quite a detailed question, but David, is a license required there?
Okay, so in order for an employer to operate in the U.S., usually there's a requirement to set up a federal employer ID number. If you were going to operate in the state of California, California will require a state registration. How to get, I think the rest of the question dealt with getting employees and such. Jerome, can you
Yeah.
just repeat that piece?
Yeah, they say, we're only delighted to start payroll in California. What is the best way to get clients there? Would you recommend a software? Yeah. We might be
a little beyond us.
Yeah.
What industry? Yeah.
So, okay, we have another question here. For a typical organisation, how much of the payroll data would you be able to source from the corporate HR system as opposed to going directly to the local office stroke employee level?
So if I can touch on that one too.
Yeah.
Each payroll system, right? So if you think about that three-level structure that we spoke about, governance, program management, local processor, each local processor is going to have a locally sourced payroll technology that's going to keep its own gross to net. That might be just a payroll system, sort of like an ADP, or it may be an HR system as well. But each country is going to have its own specific bespoke type of technology. That technology is going to feed data into some sort of consolidating technology, kind of like the Immedis software that you're looking at here, which allows you to then take that data and report off it for accounting or management purposes, and then distribute it, maybe back into that ERP for use by the company. So it's local and a consolidating repository.
Right, thanks, David. Okay, I don't think we're kind of running out of time, so we have to get to the other questions after the webinar, and we'll send you the answers to those. Well, thanks for joining us today. Thanks also to our speakers, David, Christine, and Mark. It's been a pleasure running this webinar for you, and I'd like to wish you best of luck with your global payroll, and hope you join us again for another Payroll World webinar soon. The slides will be available, and also you'll be able to listen again to the webinar, and there'll be details of that on our website. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jerome.
Thank you, Jerome, and thank you all.
Thanks very much, everybody.